Hey guys, I'm really sorry but there won't be any video this week and maybe not for next week either. I'll kind of show you something. I'm lucky to be alive. Cheryl and I moved into this house a couple of months ago now and there's still a lot of things to be doing. So on weekends we do projects around the house such as gardening, tiling, putting lights up, all those sorts of things. Anyway, this week it was a bit rainy, so we decided to tackle a few of the inside jobs that we've got going on. One being the wine rack we're putting in the family room or dining room area. Not that we drink a lot of wine, but we do drink some every now and again. And we live in the wine region of the Hunter Valley, so you've got to have a wine rack. Anyway, we were using the saw bench to trim the timber panels back for the wine rack, to make them fit in the cavity that's there. Now this is a picture of the wine rack, and you can see how we're putting the timber in the sides and then the shelves in. Eventually there'll be some crosses in there so that you can just put your bottles in there. And to do this I was using our table saw. There's nothing out of the ordinary there. We've used this table saw time and time again. Put a brand new blade in it a few weeks ago. Basically it's been a very good saw. The saw was built in the 1960s, maybe the 70s. It's got a cast iron table on it and solid componentry. There's nothing flimsy about it. It's got good fences on it that are solid to use. Anyway, we'll go into the garage and I'll show you exactly what had happened and how I ended up with that injury, which nearly, it nearly cost me my life, and it was pretty close. I nearly wasn't here. I was pushing this piece of chipboard through the saw and it caught the blade and kicked back. There's nothing normally threatening about this happening, as the timber rides up against the anti-kickback and lifts the board clear of the cutting blade. And the anti-kickback's normally here. It was in place when this happened, but when it kicked back for some reason, the anti-kickback was pushed back against the blade and ripped out of the machine. Okay, I'll just wind this blade down. So that blade's fairly new. It was only replaced a few weeks ago. We've been using this saw a fair bit, but this was the problem right here. See these two bolts? They hold the anti-kickback in. Everything's now out of whack because of what's happened. The blade's bent. You can hear it rubbing there. It wasn't beforehand. So the anti-kickback normally bolts on here using these two bolts. It normally has a slot in it so that it can be adjusted up and down. See that the area around me is a bit congested at the moment. When this incident actually happened, there was nothing around the machine. All the stuff behind me was outside on the ground. That timber wasn't there because we had our offcuts over here, but they were hanging outside the door and had to put them inside so that we could go to the hospital. Oh shit, that hurt. So when this all happened, I was standing here like this. That's the blade there, and it was lined up with this part of my body. I was looking out this side of the blade, looking at this edge, and concentrating on keeping this up against the fence that I had up here. As the anti-kickback ripped out of the saw, it came up like a bullet and basically ripped into my chest. If you think of someone giving you a dead leg and just with their knuckle straight on your thigh, just think of that pain but not going away, because that's exactly what it felt like. As well as that, it was also stinging. So I dare say that was my body fighting off infection. Cheryl had just gone back into the house when she heard this thing explode, and it gave out a big bang. She was sanding a piece of timber just over here next to me, and I'd started up this saw and she'd left her hearing protection in on the bench inside where we'd been nailing it. I walked back into the house knowing I wasn't in good shape. I hadn't even looked down to see what had happened to me, but I could start to feel the blood sort of trickling down my chest onto my stomach. This is the point I told Cheryl to call me an ambulance because she was coming back out into the garage to see what was going on. I looked back down to see this anti-kickback guard sticking out of my chest. I grabbed hold of it to stop it moving any further into my chest, and I went and sat down on the bench out the front. This is the anti-kickback that was lodged into my chest. You can see here all the little, I'll just hold that up behind it, you can see there all the little barbs where the tooth grabbed it to rip it out. And this is the bit that tore out. So normally that's a slot. So that's the start of the slot, and it should have the identical bit at this end. And that bit of steel should have gone around there. And this is the piece of shirt that was lodged in my chest. This kind of grabbed my shirt on the way through. But that's how much shirt was actually stuck inside me. They cut it off flush with my skin. When it first happened, it was probably in that much, so that's probably, I don't know, 40, 50 millimetres. And then by the time I got to the hospital, there was that much still hanging in there. So very lucky, and lucky that it went down like that. Anyway, the police were first on the scene, and I thought it was a bit odd at first. I'll explain more about that in a few minutes. So my neighbour next door here, my wife asked him if he knew of any doctors or anything in the area, because I basically needed one pretty badly. He went and got one of the paramedics that lives around the corner here. She came over fairly quickly and just basically checked me out, kept me stable, all that sort of thing. So she stayed here until the paramedics arrived, and in this next photo you can see her in the background with the paramedics just coming in. Anyway, this is where it got really weird. So I thought I was just going for an ambulance ride. So next to arrive was a fire truck, and then an ambulance, and then another fire truck, and then a police motorbike, and then we had this thing fly overhead. This footage was taken from a neighbour that lives down in another street, a good friend of ours, and he sent it to me sort of saying, "Do you know anything about this?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I do." Anyway, they told me the helicopter was in the area, which I found out later to be a bit of a fib to keep me calm. They actually dispatched the helicopter for me. They treat these chest injuries very, very seriously after the Steve Irwin incident some years ago, where Steve received a barb from a stingray into his heart that penetrated his chest cavity. So what they do with these sorts of injuries now is they prioritise them, and they get you to hospital as fast as possible. So in this case it meant helicopter. Anyway, an ambulance crew brought the doctor and medical team up from the helicopter. The doctor checked me out again with an ultrasound. He put a cannula in my hand, administered me with some antibiotics to fight off any infection, while the other crew worked on this wound and stabilised a bit of material that was sticking in my chest to make sure that it wouldn't penetrate any further. It was actually working its way out slowly the whole time. By the time I got to the hospital, it wasn't sticking in by very much. So they loaded me onto the gurney. They lifted me up into the back of the ambulance, and the ambulance took me down to where the helicopter had landed. They then slid me into the helicopter on a backboard, like a big sort of shiny piece of nylon, so to speak. And then they put a crane underneath the bed and picked me up and spun me around like that. What they didn't realise that my feet were hanging out over the end of the bed. And as they've spun me around, I'm going, ow, ow, because they were dragging my feet through all the gear at the back of the helicopter. And they thought, "Oh, is your chest all right?" I'm like, "No, not my chest, it's my feet." They went, "Oh, we're so sorry. Not used to having tall people in the helicopter." It was a quick 10-minute ride to the hospital. They kept monitoring me the whole way, and then when I got into the hospital, there was a barrage of people there. There were 2 surgeons, probably 4 or 5 nurses. There was X-ray. There was the crew from the helicopter, ultrasound doctor, and a a few other people. I don't really know exactly what they were all doing, but they were all there for a reason. They were deeply concerned that this had penetrated my lung, and that my lung was filling up with fluid or blood, and that I was going to end up drowning in my own blood. So they took an X-ray. They found that the piece of steel hadn't penetrated into my chest cavity. I've actually got a very sore rib because it hit my rib. So from here the surgeon came down, he did an assessment. He basically said there wasn't any need for surgery to remove it. He thinks you should be able to remove it without doing any surgery. They gave me some pain relief via the cannula. It basically spaced me out a bit. And then they gave me some local anaesthetic in the chest area. Once the anaesthetic started to work, they basically pulled the piece of steel out. It had done a bit of damage going in, but it also did damage coming out. It's out of my body, it's not going to cause me any more harm. What they've done here, they've just given me a stitch, and they've left the rest of it open just so it can drain. And they said if they stitch it up anymore at this point, it's probably going to cause me problems down the track, so they just decided to just leave it and let my body heal it up on its own. From that point I was pretty much out of the woods. They kept a nurse in there monitoring me. A couple of hours went by. They gave me a shot of tetanus. They gave me some more antibiotics, and then they took some more X-rays just to make sure there was nothing going on in my chest, and they let me go. So what I'll say at this point, this was just a one-off accident, and a freaky one at that. Now on to the medical teams. Okay, so the two police that came straight away, they've both contacted me since to see how I'm going. Yeah, just not what you expect these days. The whole emergency teams, I think, have changed a lot in the last sort of 10 years. You know, like, it's just amazing the amount of care that they put into people now.